In the year 1887, the town of Ashvale, Massachusetts, was a place where the winds carried with them the echo of sermons, the metallic ring of blacksmiths' hammers, and the gentle toll of bells from the chapel that sat at the edge of the green. Life in that part of New England was as much about faith and family as it was about survival against harsh winters and poor harvests. Yet, within this small town, hidden in plain sight, the Ashvale family bore a tradition so unholy that its existence was spoken only in tremors and glances. It was in that year, when the first spade struck the ground of the family plot, that the legacy of the Ashvales began to set itself apart from all others. While most families gathered in churches to remember their dead, the Ashvales chose to disturb the soil, to raise their ancestors from the cold earth, not with reverence, but with a grim determination that belonged to something older and far darker than Christian burial rites. The Ashvale estate lay at the town's northern edge, a looming colonial house whose shutters creaked in the wind and whose cellar doors were always locked. It was said the family kept their dead closer than the living, and when the first exhumation occurred in the autumn of 1887, neighbors noted strange movements around the family plot long past midnight. Lantern light flickered between the trees, tools clanged against the stones, and muffled voices carried through the chill October air. By morning, fresh soil was scattered across the graves, but the coffins were not sealed as they should have been. There were whispers of bodies lifted out, placed upon linen, their bones handled with unnerving familiarity. Townsfolk watched from their windows, paralyzed by a dread that they could not explain, yet no one dared to question the Ashvales openly, for fear that their attention might turn outward. Those who lived closest to the family claimed they heard chanting, low and guttural, slipping through the forest at night when the Ashvales gathered. Witnesses would later speak of the children being present, standing silently beside their elders, learning by sight and silence. What was being passed down to them was not a tradition of remembrance, but of obedience to a practice that reeked of the grave. The first dig of 1887 was not simply an act of desecration, it was the opening of a cycle, a covenant etched not in scripture, but in dirt and decomposition. The Ashvales did not remove their ancestors to mourn them, but to bind themselves, as though the blood that flowed in their veins demanded reunion with the flesh that once held it. In the days that followed, a peculiar smell drifted from the estate, acrid and heavy, seeping into the clothes of those who passed too near. Some said it was the odor of embalming fluids, though the town doctor swore the family had no such access to chemicals. Others claimed it was the musk of decay itself, carried upward from open coffins hidden beneath the floorboards of the Ashvale home. When neighbors inquired too closely, they were met with silence, or worse, a cold smile that offered no answers. The local priest attempted to address it from the pulpit, but even he faltered. For how could one condemn a family so deeply tied to the town's history, one whose roots reached back to the earliest settlers? The Ashvales were bound to the land, and the land, it seemed, was bound to them. The records from 1887 show no arrests, no interventions, only the uneasy acceptance that something unspeakable had occurred. Diaries from nearby households reveal entries of unease, written in hurried hands about lights in the cemetery and shadows that seemed to linger long after the Ashvales had gone. It was the first time the town of Ashvale understood that the family had their own calendar, a private reckoning not measured by seasons or harvests, but by the turning of a decade. The graveyard was not sacred to them, but a ledger, a place where debts of blood were revisited and renewed. Each spadeful of dirt was a reminder that the Ashvales were digging for something more than bodies. They were searching for continuity, for a secret embedded in their very marrow. By the winter of that year, snow covered the cemetery, masking the disruptions beneath, yet the memory of that first dig remained. Parents warned their children not to wander near the Ashvale land after dusk, and travelers passing through felt the weight of unease when their carriages rolled past the estate's looming gates. Something had shifted within the town, a fracture between those who clung to the sanctity of the dead and the family who chose to disturb it. The Ashvales did not speak of their reasons, but their actions spoke louder than any sermon, louder than the tolling bell that tried and failed to wash the sin from the town's conscience. The first dig of 1887 became the foundation of a cycle that would repeat itself with dreadful regularity, each decade drawing the living closer to the dead, each exhumation a step deeper into the soil of their horrific lineage. The whispers began almost immediately after the first disturbance of the graves, carried not only through spoken words, but in the atmosphere of the town itself, as though the soil exhaled its own secrets. In the taverns, in the market stalls, and behind shuttered windows, people murmured about what they thought they had seen and heard when the Ashvales moved among the tombstones. Some claimed that during those nights the earth trembled lightly beneath their feet, as if the ground itself recoiled at being opened once more. Others whispered that the family had unearthed not just bones, but something that seemed to breathe, something that did not belong in the daylight world. These were not tales told by children, but mutterings of grown men and women who lowered their voices, terrified that the family might somehow hear their doubts carried on the wind. Fear kept their stories hushed, but fear also ensured they were never forgotten, and so the whispers beneath the soil began to coil themselves into the life of the town. On cold evenings, when fog crept along the cemetery wall, figures were seen moving in pairs, carrying small bundles wrapped in cloth from the family's plots to the house. They said the bundles were too large to be relics, too heavy to be trinkets, and the way the carriers bent their backs suggested they bore a burden both physical and spiritual. The whispers suggested that the Ashvales were preserving their dead, keeping them within their home, as one might keep heirlooms on a shelf. What unsettled the neighbors most was not the act itself, but the eerie quietness with which it was done, as if this macabre duty brought no grief, no disgust, no hesitation. The Ashvales, it seemed, carried their ancestors as naturally as one might carry firewood, and that notion seeped into the minds of the townsfolk, gnawing at their sense of what was natural and what was profane. By spring, the gossip deepened into stories of ritual. It was said that in the cellar of the estate, where lamps glowed long after midnight, the bodies were set in a circle and the family gathered among them. Some swore they heard faint chanting carried through the stone foundations of the house, a low hum that grew into waves of sound like prayer or incantation. Farmers returning late from their fields described feeling watched when they passed near the northern ridge, as though unseen eyes followed them from beneath the ground itself. Children were told to avoid the cemetery at all costs, though some dared each other to peek through the iron bars of the gate. Those who did often returned pale and shaking, unwilling to speak of what they thought they had seen among the leaning gravestones. The whispers beneath the soil were no longer just talk among neighbors. They became something that weighed on the air, a presence that made the town restless even in daylight. There were stories of the soil itself changing, of patches in the Ashvale plot where grass refused to grow and where the ground was damp even in the driest of months. Neighbors who walked too near claimed they felt the earth soften under their boots, as though the ground had not finished settling after being disturbed. A midwife spoke of dreams she had, in which skeletal hands reached from the soil, not to claw their way out, but to beckon her closer, urging her to listen to a language she did not understand. Dreams and waking life blurred for many in the town, until the whispers beneath the soil became as real as the toll of the church bell, as unavoidable as the coming of winter. It was as if the very earth in Ashvale Hollow had taken on the family's secret, guarding it jealously, feeding it back into the ears of those who did not wish to hear. For the Ashvales themselves, silence was their greatest weapon. They neither denied nor confirmed the accusations, meeting questions with blank stares or smiles that carried no warmth. This lack of explanation gave the whispers room to grow wild, each retelling adding another layer of dread. A passing clergyman once tried to confront the family, demanding to see their plot and questioning their practices, but he vanished from town within a week, leaving only his traveling case at the inn. The whispers tied his absence to the Ashvales, though no evidence was ever found. To the townsfolk, it was proof enough that the family's hands reached further than their land, that whatever lived beneath their soil had the power to silence those who spoke too loudly. By the turn of the decade, the whispers were no longer confined to the townspeople but etched themselves into written records, notes in margins of parish ledgers, diary entries hidden in locked drawers, warnings scrawled in trembling script. They carried with them a steady rhythm of dread, each line suggesting that something beneath the soil resisted rest, that the dead of Ashvale Hollow had been bound to the living in ways unnatural and cruel. What began as mutterings of neighbors grew into a permanent stain on the memory of the town, a shadow that whispered through generations, so that even long after the first exhumation, people still felt their hearts quicken when they walked past the Ashvale gates, wondering if beneath the ground there were ears still listening. The children of Ashvale Hollow were perhaps the most haunting part of the family's legacy, for they were not raised in innocence but in the shadow of soil and bone. From the moment they could walk, they were led by their elders into the cemetery, their small hands clutching candles that sputtered in the cold wind. Neighbors who glimpsed them from afar described the unsettling sight of children standing in perfect stillness among the gravestones, their faces pale and solemn, never crying, never laughing, as though they understood from birth that their role was not to live freely, but to serve the tradition their blood demanded. It was said the youngest learned their letters not from books, but from the names etched into weather-worn headstones, tracing the grooves with tiny fingers as their parents whispered the family lineage. What was education for other children became indoctrination for the Ashvales, each lesson a reminder that their heritage was rooted not in the present, but in the dead who lay beneath their feet. There are accounts from 1897 that describe the children carrying shovels far too large for their frames, following behind the adults during the second exhumation. Their eyes were wide, but not with fear, more with a strange kind of fascination, as though they were witnessing something sacred. Some townsfolk swore that one of the boys, no older than 7, leaned into an open coffin and whispered to the remains, listening as if expecting an answer. Whether this was a child's imagination or something darker was never clear, but those who saw it retold the story with a shiver, convinced that the children were being prepared not simply to inherit the estate, but to inherit the rituals that bound the family together. These young ones grew up with an unnatural comfort around death, their games consisting not of dolls or marbles, but of bones carefully unearthed and arranged like puzzles in the dirt. The hollow itself seemed to respond to the children, as if the land recognized its future keepers. They wandered the graveyard paths at dusk, barefoot in the cold grass, whispering to each other in voices too soft to hear, pointing to graves as if receiving instructions. Travelers passing through described seeing them perched on low branches like watchful crows, their eyes following silently until the strangers moved out of sight. Some claimed that the laughter of children, sharp and sudden, would erupt from the cemetery at night, though no one dared enter to confirm whether it belonged to the Ashvale heirs or to something else entirely. What was certain was that the presence of those children deepened the sense of dread surrounding the family. For there is something more terrifying in the corruption of youth than in the deeds of hardened adults. Their education was secretive and insular, with no tutors from the town and no attendance at the schoolhouse. It was said that their curriculum consisted of scripture stripped of salvation, anatomy taught without medicine, and family law spoken in whispers over candlelit tables. The children were forbidden from friendships beyond their bloodline, and though townsfolk sometimes saw them watching from behind iron gates, no one could recall them ever speaking to outsiders. Their isolation bred speculation. Some believed they were groomed to communicate with the dead, others that they were vessels for something the family dared not utter aloud. Their pale complexions and unblinking stares became symbols of unease in Ashvale, reminders that innocence had been buried along with their ancestors, leaving behind only the hollow shells of youth molded into instruments of ritual. As the decades passed, those children grew into adults who carried the same lifeless calm as their parents before them. But the memory of their childhood lingered in the town's conscience, preserved in diary entries that spoke of sightings too uncanny to forget. One farmer wrote of seeing the children kneeling in the snow around a freshly dug grave, their breath misting in the air, their hands clasped as though in prayer. Another woman described hearing them sing a melody without words, a rising and falling chant that made her blood run cold even from a distance. These accounts, scattered yet consistent, painted a portrait of youth that was stripped of warmth, reshaped into instruments of a cycle that could not be broken. The children of Ashvale Hollow were not raised to choose their path. They were raised to dig, to listen, and to remember. Even long after those particular children had grown and passed into adulthood, their memory endured in the minds of the townsfolk who lived on. The unease was not only about what they had witnessed, but about what it meant for the future. For every generation seemed destined to raise children in the same manner, to pass down the same cold rituals like a torch in the darkness. In the eyes of the townspeople, the Ashvale family did not truly grow older or younger. It simply rotated its faces, one generation seamlessly replacing the last, each child becoming another link in the chain that tethered the living to the dead. And so the children of Ashvale Hollow became both victims and perpetrators of their family's curse, their lives molded into the soil as surely as the bones they were raised to exhume. The candlelit rituals of the Ashvale family were the heart of their lineage, the gatherings that tied each generation back to the disturbed earth and to the ancestors they refused to let rest. When night fell over Ashvale Hollow, the windows of the estate glowed faintly, their flames flickering against warped glass, visible to those who dared walk the nearby roads. Townsfolk spoke of hearing low murmurs carried on the wind, the rise and fall of voices reciting words that did not resemble prayer but something far more primal. Inside, the family arranged their exhumed ancestors in a circle, each body wrapped in linen and set upon the stone floor of the cellar, while the living knelt between them, holding candles that dripped wax into shallow bowls. The flames cast long shadows, elongating the faces of the family until they seemed less like people and more like silhouettes of the dead themselves, caught in some unholy reflection. The rituals were said to last through the night, beginning with silence, the Ashvales sitting in absolute stillness as though waiting for something to arrive. Some accounts from servants who once worked in the house suggest that the silence would eventually be broken by the matriarch, her voice low and steady, calling out the names of each ancestor one by one. Each family member echoed the names in unison, their voices layering together until the cellar reverberated with a sound that seemed to rise from the ground itself. After this, the candles were passed around, and each child was made to drip wax over the bones of those unearthed, a symbolic sealing of kinship that blurred the line between flesh and spirit. For the Ashvales, these ceremonies were not symbolic but binding, as if each gesture reinforced a pact made long before the town of Ashvale had even been founded. Neighbors who lived closest swore they could smell the rituals even from outside, the sickly mix of burning tallow, damp soil, and something acrid that carried through the cold night air. Those who described it often hesitated, unwilling to name the odor outright, though most admitted it resembled the stench of rot. Some claimed to hear faint wails during the later hours, though whether these came from the mouths of the family or from something else altogether was never known. The rituals left the town uneasy, for they were not held once or twice a year, but with regularity, almost as though the Ashvales treated them like seasonal duties, aligning with the phases of the moon and the shifting of the earth. Every generation was brought into the practice, their faces illuminated by candlelight as they repeated words passed down from centuries past, words that no one outside the family had ever been permitted to record. The cellar itself was a place of dread, its stone walls darkened by soot and dampness, its shelves lined with objects that served no clear purpose outside the rituals. Broken fragments of mirrors, bundles of hair tied with string, and jars containing substances that no apothecary in town could identify. It was whispered that the Ashvales anointed the bones with oils that gave off noxious fumes, believing these substances preserved the connection between body and spirit. During these ceremonies, it was said the family painted their faces with ash and soil, smearing themselves until their skin looked as pale and cracked as the corpses they surrounded. In this way, they blurred themselves with their dead, until the boundary between ancestor and descendant seemed to dissolve in the flickering light. Stories passed through generations told of one particular ritual in 1907, when a storm battered the town and lightning split the sky. On that night, a witness from a nearby property claimed to see dozens of candles burning in the family's windows, far more than the household should have possessed. The light glowed so fiercely it seemed to pulse, as though the house itself were alive with a heartbeat of fire. That same night, several townsfolk reported hearing chanting louder than ever before, a resonance that vibrated through their floors and walls, making dishes rattle and doors tremble. Some awoke to find soil scattered across their porches, as if carried by the wind from the Ashvale plot. To them, this was no coincidence, but a sign that the rituals had grown in strength, that something had stirred in the hollow and reached out beyond the family's estate. Town records from 1917 note a surge of complaints about disturbances near the Ashvale property, though no one dared file them formally under their own names. Anonymous accounts detail how neighbors heard noises beneath the ground, faint but insistent, as though something stirred below the roots of the hollow. Some even swore they saw the ground breathe, rising and falling as though the cemetery was alive. These testimonies, though lacking proof, carried enough weight to instill a collective fear that could not be shaken. Farmers avoided ploughing near the family's borders, Tradesmen refused to deliver supplies after dusk, and children were threatened with harsh punishment if they so much as lingered by the gates. The fear was not just of the family themselves, but of what they represented. An ancient pact, a shadow of something older than the town, something that resisted the order of life and death. Church sermons grew sharper in their language, ministers weaving veiled condemnations into their homilies, though never daring to speak the family's name outright. Parishioners nodded gravely, understanding well enough the warnings buried in those words. Yet when pressed to act, the clergy faltered, unwilling to confront the Ashvales directly. The fear of divine judgment was outweighed by the fear of earthly consequence, for everyone knew stories of outsiders who questioned too boldly and vanished soon after. There were accounts of visiting investigators who arrived to examine the grave sites and never completed their reports, their belongings found days later abandoned in nearby inns. These disappearances only deepened the terror, convincing the townsfolk that whatever power the Ashvales commanded was capable of silencing even those from beyond their borders. The fear grew silent, buried like the bodies in the hollow, never voiced openly but felt in every cautious glance toward the family estate. The testimonies preserved in local archives capture the tone of a community held hostage by its own dread. A widow wrote of nights when she woke to see figures in the cemetery holding lanterns, their light moving slowly between the stones, only to vanish when approached. Another account told of a boy who disappeared for 3 days, later found near the Ashvale property with no memory of where he had been, his clothes damp with soil and his fingernails caked with dirt. He spoke of voices that had called to him, pulling him closer to the family's land, though no one could make sense of his ramblings. Such stories were whispered through the generations, becoming cautionary tales that ensured no one strayed too near, yet none were ever disproven. Fear, after all, does not require proof to thrive. It needs only silence, secrecy, and the sense that the ground beneath your feet holds more than roots. Even officials were not immune to the unease. Records show that property disputes involving the Ashvales were routinely dismissed without argument, as if the mere mention of their land closed the matter entirely. When fires broke out near the estate in 1929, the fire brigade responded sluggishly, holding back as if reluctant to disturb whatever smoldered on that cursed ground. Testimonies later revealed that the flames seemed to burn cold, giving off light but little heat, leaving behind scorched patterns in the soil that resembled symbols no one dared identify. These strange accounts only strengthened the belief that the family operated under laws beyond the reach of the town and that interference invited peril. Fear had made even the most rational men step back, allowing the Ashvales to continue their practices unchallenged, their rituals protected not by secrecy but by the silence of those too frightened to speak. As the decades passed, the fear of the outsiders did not fade but instead rooted itself deeper, becoming part of the town's very identity. Families told their children to avoid Ashvale Hollow in the same way they warned them against thin ice or wandering wolves. Shopkeepers locked their doors earlier on nights when the family's rituals were suspected, whispering to themselves that safety came in staying far from that northern ridge. Testimonies written in the margins of dusty ledgers and parish notes described the same themes repeated endlessly: strange lights, distant voices, and an unshakable sense that the dead in Ashvale Hollow were not at rest. Each story, whether true or twisted by fear, became another brick in the wall of dread that surrounded the family, sealing them off from the community yet ensuring their legacy remained unforgettable. The outsiders feared not only what the Ashvales had done, but what they might do again, for each decade brought with it the reminder that the past was never buried, only waiting beneath the soil. The Ashvale family's lineage was marked by a disturbing truth that outsiders struggled to comprehend, for while other graves in the town decayed as time dictated, the bodies of the Ashvales refused to yield to the natural course of rot. When coffins were opened during their rituals, it was said the remains were not always skeletal but strangely preserved, their flesh leathery, their features still identifiable decades after burial. Such accounts were whispered by those few who caught glimpses during the processions from the cemetery to the estate, when linen-wrapped figures were carried with reverence and lit only by lantern glow. What frightened the witnesses most was not only the appearance of the bodies, but the suggestion that the family expected them to look that way, as though they had prepared for their ancestors to remain intact, to linger between life and death as silent members of the gathering. It was a defiance of time itself, a refusal of decay that set the Ashvales apart from every other household in Massachusetts. By 1937, rumors had taken hold that the family employed secret methods to preserve their dead, techniques not known to local undertakers or physicians. There were stories of strange salves rubbed into the skin of the exhumed, concoctions of herbs and unidentifiable substances that gave off a smell both sweet and rancid at once. Others believed the preservation had nothing to do with earthly methods, but was instead a result of the rituals themselves, that the chants and ceremonies tied the flesh to the family in ways no science could explain. Whatever the cause, the effect was undeniable. The Ashvale dead did not appear as corpses, but as dormant figures, waiting, their eyes sealed, but their faces eerily serene. Those who knew of this detail spoke rarely of it, for to acknowledge it was to admit that something unnatural pulsed within that bloodline. There were occasional incidents when outsiders stumbled too close and paid the price for their curiosity. One such account from 1947 tells of a grave digger who had been hired to assist the family during their decade ritual, a man desperate for coin who ignored the warnings. He was later found wandering the outskirts of town in a daze, muttering about bodies that breathed without lungs, lips that parted though no sound came forth. His mind fractured. He spoke of skin that felt warm to the touch even after decades underground. He did not live long afterward, and his testimony was buried with him, but his story became another thread woven into the legend of the Ashvales. These tales only fueled the terror that surrounded them, convincing the townsfolk that death in the hollow was not an ending but a threshold that no one fully crossed. In family portraits that survived in the town records, the resemblance between generations was uncanny. The same eyes staring out from faces a century apart, the same sharp lines of the jaw repeating endlessly. Some claimed the reason the bodies did not decay was because the family had found a way to reclaim their own flesh, to siphon vitality from one generation into the next. This belief was strengthened by sightings of the Ashvales who aged slower than expected, their skin unwrinkled, their gait steady even as the years advanced. Elders in the town remembered seeing the same faces in their youth that their grandchildren recognized in their old age, and it bred the conviction that time itself bent differently around that family. Whether it was preservation or something darker, the Ashvales carried themselves with the confidence of those who did not fear the grave. The family's cemetery, hidden beneath rows of leaning stones, became a place of pilgrimage for the fearful and the curious alike. Some braved the edge of the property to see for themselves, reporting that the ground seemed to pulse faintly with warmth, as though heat radiated upward from the coffins below. Others found small fragments of bone or bits of fabric rising through the soil, artifacts of bodies that should have crumbled to dust, but instead pushed upward, defying the weight of time. These signs convinced many that the refusal of decay was not limited to the family members, but infected the land itself, twisting the natural order into something unwholesome. To those who lived near Ashvale Hollow, it felt as if the cemetery was alive, feeding and breathing in ways that no burial ground should. As decades continued to pass, the unease grew into certainty. The Ashvale family did not belong to the same laws of flesh and death that governed others. Every unearthed ancestor was treated less like a corpse and more like a companion, brought into candlelight with reverence, their faces studied by children who recognized their features as though looking into mirrors. The lineage that refused decay was not only a curiosity, but a terror, a reminder that the family's bond with the grave was not symbolic but physical, binding their blood to something eternal and unnatural. The townsfolk, in hushed voices, admitted what they dared not say aloud in public, that the Ashvales had found a way to cheat the soil, to exist in a space where the body was never fully lost, where death was not a conclusion but a continuation, and where the silence of the grave was never guaranteed. By the middle of the 20th century, the Ashvale family had become less a collection of individuals and more a legend that loomed over Massachusetts like a shadow that could not be shaken. Their estate, though weathered and sagging with age, remained untouched by fire or neglect, its shutters still rattling in the wind, its iron gates still chained though rarely locked. The final dig, as it came to be called, was not marked in any town ledger or official record, but in the memories of those who lived close enough to feel the vibrations beneath the soil. It was in 1967, on an October night when the moon hung swollen and yellow over the hollow, that the townsfolk claimed the Ashvales gathered for their most elaborate ritual. a ceremony that seemed to draw not only their living kin, but every ancestor they had disturbed across decades. Witnesses described flickering light spilling out from the estate as though every room had been filled with fire, though no smoke rose from the chimneys, and the bells from the nearby church tower tolled without a hand pulling their ropes. Those who dared approach the estate that night said the earth groaned beneath their feet, a deep and steady sound like the turning of something vast underground. From the cemetery came the unmistakable sound of wood splintering, as if dozens of coffins had been pried open at once. What emerged from that place was never seen directly, but the neighbors who swore to it claimed that figures moved across the property, wrapped in linen, their steps deliberate and heavy. Some insisted the Ashvales had succeeded in raising not only the bones but the forms of their dead, creating a procession that wound from the graveyard into the cellar of the house. It was not a burial, but an arrival, as though the family had spent generations preparing for a gathering that would unite every link of their bloodline in one place, one night, one final binding. The testimonies written after that autumn night were filled with contradictions, as though those who witnessed it struggled to make sense of what they had seen. One man described lights that swirled above the hollow like fireflies, except they glowed blue and hummed like bees. Another claimed he heard voices calling his name, though no one stood near, the words dragging him forward until he fled in terror. A woman wrote that she saw the children of the family standing on the roof of the house, their faces pale and lit by the glow beneath them, chanting in unison as though guiding the procession below. The images conflicted, but the fear in their descriptions was consistent, heavy with the weight of something unholy that had slipped through the cracks of the earth. By morning the estate was quiet, though the cemetery bore the scars of disruption, mounds of dirt piled unevenly, stones cracked and toppled as though the ground itself had convulsed. No one in town saw the family for weeks afterward, and when at last an Ashvale appeared again in public, it was one of the younger sons, his face gaunt and his hair prematurely white. He spoke to no one, though his eyes carried a look that chilled even the boldest who tried to meet them. Parish records note that in the weeks following, livestock miscarried in unusual numbers, milk soured within hours of being collected, and townsfolk woke with unexplained bruises across their arms and legs. The final dig was never openly discussed in town meetings, but its presence lingered in the rhythms of daily life, a bruise beneath the skin that would not fade.